Hi. World's on fire. Yours? Okay, well, here's a little rabbit hole I went down that kind of gets messier the more it goes, but it's a pretty good distraction. So I'm just gonna look at my notes and give y'all the information. In the 1970s, there was a Stanford psychology professor, and his name was David Rosenhan. He came up with this whole experiment where he wanted to understand the difference between sane and insane. He wanted to know how we measure them and if sanity and insanity exist, like, are we able to observe it? And in order to find out, he sent 8 healthy people to around 22 psychiatric institutions. And the experiment went on to highlight the pitfalls of the current um, institutional system at the time. Mental health care kind of wasn't the most clear cut and it wasn't the safest at the time. So he called into question how diagnostic standards are even made, and he placed a highlight on how healthcare was done historically up until that point in the 1970s. For context, not many people realize that psychology is a relatively young science, compared to stuff like math. Math has been around for thousands of years, but psychology is only about 180 years old, and the way that we practice psychology in the West is somewhere in between that range of 180 to 150. So many people didn't really trust it, and by the late 1960s, 1970s, when this experiment was conducted, attitudes towards psychology were relatively low. Like, a lot of people didn't have the best confidence within the field, and most people were just uncertain about it. And clinicians felt like they were lagging behind their medical peers. Like, you have a cardiologist, you have, I don't know, someone that does autopsies, even, who knows more about the human body than a psychologist does. It wasn't respected the same. So psychiatrists especially felt really ashamed of their profession, and they wanted to prove that they were just as good as real medicine. And America was in the middle of yet another season of war and civil unrest at the time. So there was a massive anti psychiatry movement because of it. And psychiatrists were trying to build different standards for diagnosis and treatment, or even cure. Around the time they were kind of making changes to it, like, they had voted out homosexually sexually. Happy Pride. They had they had essentially removed homosexuality as a mental disorder from the DSM-2 around the time this study came out. So the science was already changing and trying to update as things went along. But once this study came out, psychiatrists were scrambling to fix their reputation because it had blown something wide open in the entirety of how they do intake for these institutions and what institutions were like when they were in it. And when Rosenhan developed his study, he wanted his students to understand sanity more up close and personal. So he wanted to test the validity of it by kind of pushing for reformation within these psychiatric institutions, by being able to point at these institutions from the inside and say, hey, I know what's going on here, and you're going to fix it, or else, the science is defunct. Like, he really didn't think that psychiatry and the way that psychiatrists went about things was the proper way, and he was very much anti-psychiatry himself, even though he was a psychology professor at Stanford. So it's a whole thing. But by the time he started his study, he had 8 patients, which I'm going to be talking about throughout the rest of this as pseudo patients. And these pseudo patients were 8 participants that consisted of 3 women and 5 men. In some reports, it alleges that Rosenhan was one of the 5 men within it, just to go in and be his own control, apparently. And when they showed up across these 22 institutions around the US, it was spread out across each coast, each mountain range, if you want to even get into there. Um, but he told every pseudo patient to go into these institutions and essentially pretend that they're having auditory hallucinations. So the specific thing he wanted these people to say when they went in and spoke to the intake professional was, I'm hearing voices, I'm hearing things like hollow, empty, thud, as in to kind of make their symptoms vague and sound like they're having an existential crisis where their life feels hollow, empty, and they want a thud, if that makes sense. And it was to kind of test the psychiatry staff and the staff of the hospital generally of how they would treat somebody that is dealing with hallucinations. And for the most part, aside from these symptoms, the pseudo patients kind of stuck to their own script where they told the truth about everything except for their real names, their occupations, and they kind of tweaked some of their personal information so that it wasn't too close to the truth and so that they weren't found out, so that their identities were kind of cloaked and they would be safe. The biggest thing I think that I read about was they as in the pseudo patients, were afraid of going to these hospitals and the psychiatrist kicking them out. But not only were they admitted to every hospital that they visited, they also were slapped with schizophrenia diagnosis, except for one person. I think one person got like manic psychosis, like as if they were going through a manic episode. But once they were admitted with these schizophrenia diagnoses, they were in these hospitals for anywhere from a week to 52 days. On average, I think the report said that they were there for about 19 days. And I'm scrolling through my notes. Notes have confirmed. So while each of them were admitted into these hospitals, instead of keeping up the ruse or keeping up those symptoms that they came in with initially, they went back to their regular behavior. So they weren't really doing anything out of the norm, and the hospital staff didn't think anything was off about it. They were like, oh, okay, well, now they're in the hospital, they're where they need to be, they're being compliant, I don't really need to worry about these patients. And so each of the pseudo patients really slid under the radar with these other patients. And hospital staff never really looked at them different from the rest. And because of that, pseudo patients stopped paying attention to real patients in the hospital to kind of glean what behaviors are part of sanity versus insanity. They stopped paying attention to patients, and they started paying attention to real staff. So as they were paying attention to staff, pseudo patients wrote about how their treatment was brutal and often dehumanizing. All but one pseudo patient said that staff were often dismissive to patients and would keep their conversations really limited. Other times, orderlies were seen verbally and physically abusing some of these patients while their peers were absent, and staff routinely ignored pseudo patients because they were actively compliant. Pseudo patients kind of wrote about how this environment made them feel incredibly hopeless and powerless at the same time, because they felt like they didn't matter within the hierarchy of the hospital system anymore. They weren't able to go and speak directly to their practitioner or their clinicians. They were just part of the regular hospital ecosystem by that point. And what's more interesting is that throughout this entire thing, none of the pseudo patients were figured out by the staff at all. Like, nobody had noticed because of how they were acting that there was something off about them. Except other patients. Other patients were like, what are you doing? You know? Because the pseudo patients were sitting around, they were taking notes, they were observing everything, not in the way that someone who is going through therapy and maybe written therapy has to write out journals and stuff we're doing, but it was very clear to these other patients that these people were different. So they would even have real patients. I think out of 118 patients that the pseudo patients allegedly lived among, 35 of them would go straight up to them and say, "Hey, are you a journalist? Are you a student, an academic? Like, what the hell are you doing here?" And they would even go to hospital staff to even say, "This person is, there's something up with this person. You need to really look into it. I think that they're not supposed to be here." And the hospital staff ignored them. Who's surprised? So by the time the pseudo patients were released from these hospitals, they were slapped with schizophrenia in remission, which is not the same as being cured or being cleared of the diagnosis. They were stuck with this diagnosis basically for the rest of their lives. It's almost like cancer in remission, where no, the person doesn't actively have cancer cells in their body anymore, but at any point it could come back. That's kind of the same thing that it's like in mental health. But the biggest thing about this is when you have a mental health disorder that is as heavy and hefty as schizophrenia, it has a lot of bigger implications. And back in those days, especially, any psychosis you described was lumped in with schizophrenia. And it was essentially like this huge catch-all disorder, particularly for people who were dealing with flashbacks at the end of Vietnam. There were a lot of Vietnam War veterans that were in these hospitals. And for PTSD, it wasn't a clear diagnosis yet. So a lot of them were given this one. And disproportionately, even now today, it was a disorder that was slapped onto black and brown men when they were exhibiting any sort of aggressive behaviors or behaviors that could have been manic but weren't exactly clear cut with the DSM that they had at the time. Nowadays, they kind of are expanding upon it and are really, the science itself for psychology is really trying to make sure that they have broader inclusions of different people and different manifestations of these types of disorders or symptoms themselves. Because just because you have a symptom doesn't mean that you have said disorder. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm going to keep going. By the end of the study, Rosenhan said that it was glaringly obvious that these professionals do not know how to properly distinguish real patients from fake patients in this hospital. And there's more to the story to that because his peers had a lot to say. When he completed this story and had essentially said, "Hey, psychiatry doesn't know what they're doing. These people do not know how to treat people in hospitals." With an already crappy reputation, it pissed a lot of people off. And before the fallout, some of the most interesting things that came out of this study was it heavily influenced the revision and the release of the 1980 DSM-3. So this version really forced the American Psychiatric Association to get in there and come up with clearer definitions and expanded categories for these mental health conditions, showing things like interactions with environment, showing things like interaction with biology. Those were not domains of psychology that were fully explored just yet. And he kind of lit a fire under psychiatry and the American Psychiatric Association to get it together. He also helped make critical changes in the treatment of mental health care. There was a glaring trend of hospitals keeping patients hospitalized unnecessarily. Like a patient would explain their symptoms, would be slapped with something really hefty that needs more time to be observed, to go through counseling and actually get to know the patient before you give them any sort of preliminary diagnosis. You really shouldn't do that. That's not how the practice should be done, but at the time, that's how it was done. And the biggest thing that he succeeded at, like I said before, was adding fuel to the anti-psychiatry movement. Like, people were pissed that he implied that they were incapable, because he was echoing the words of people in other fields of medicine who thought that psychiatry and psychology itself wasn't a worthy science. It wasn't the same. It's not real medicine. And they didn't like that. So his peers were like, absolutely not. Absolutely not. And they decided to do several peer reviews that challenged that whole thing. And in science, peer reviews are incredibly important because it's to kind of look over somebody's work and see if you can glean like ideas from it, see what implications they were trying to make for the field and how you can add to the conversation. How can you talk about it? How is this a worthy theory that the person did? Or most importantly, is this a worthy, is this a worthy experiment that is reliable and valid in terms of the measurements that this person used? And did they actually answer their hypothesis when they went through? It's also to make sure that it highlights the pitfalls in somebody's work or draws connections with the conclusions that the person who completed the study says. So peer reviews are like the bread and butter. There's something that happened regardless of what experiment was created. It's just that with this one, people had a lot more fuel and fire to throw at him with this. So, a few people were saying that Rosenhan is dishonest and he's a fraud and that everything he did does not really contribute to science in the proper way, I guess. And the best way that somebody drew a connection with it was a neuroscientist. His name was Seymour S. Ketty, and he essentially says, if I were to drink a quart of blood and conceal what I had done, come to the emergency room of any hospital, vomiting blood, the behavior of the staff would be quite predictable. If they labeled and treated me as having a bleeding peptic ulcer, I doubt I could convincingly say that medical science does not know how to diagnose that condition. Meaning that if a patient is telling the hospital something and the hospital bases their treatment of that patient on what they said, it doesn't mean that the hospital is doing something wrong or doesn't know what they're doing. The hospital is acting within the understandable range of what it is that they're up against. They're being presented with something. They're going to respond to what they're being presented until they investigate further and then figure more out. But with what Rosenhan was saying, it doesn't quite fit, and he can't make a broad sweeping generalization that because in this study that he conducted, all of the science is flawed and all of the people that are within the science don't know what the hell they're doing. Another criticism kind of went a step further because it was within the Journal of Abnormal Psychology about 2 years after Rosenhan's study was released. And in this, they kind of break it down and they agree that, yeah, there is a legitimate concern about how diagnoses are made and how they think about it within the context of each patient. and that labeling such as schizophrenia in remission is really dehumanizing because it has a greater effect on a patient's life post hospitalization, more so because of the social, not taboo, what am I because of the social implications of it, because of the stigma, that is applied to a disorder such as schizophrenia. Like it's still one of the ones that I've noticed a lot of people like to make fun of, but it's not a joke. It's not a joke. It is a very debilitating disorder. So in this report, in this peer review, they also kind of really highlight the areas of Rosenhan Experiment where he could have done better. So he says that the experiment would have worked better if psychologists were able to meet with each pseudo patient and base their diagnosis or lack of need for a diagnosis on just meeting them plainly. Like, don't come in there and don't say that you're having auditory hallucinations. If you're trying to figure out whether or not these people can discern sanity from insanity, then allow them to do so. You know, if you have pseudo patients that you know are healthy and you're sending them in, and the psychiatrist also agrees that they are a healthy person and they shouldn't be in, I think that would have been a lot. It would have been a lot more to say about the conversation versus having them go in and be fake off top and going from there. And then he points out that the interactions with the pseudo patients in the hospital, it was pointed out through Rosenhan's study that it's, oh my God, they flew under the radar. Nobody knew that these people were faking except for real patients. And, you know, you get caught up in it and it gets sensationalized. But this peer review kind of brings it down to earth because it's like, hey, the way that the pseudo patients were acting in the hospitals had nothing to do with sanity or insanity. It has everything to do with hospitalization and the expectations of people in the hospital. Because you wouldn't expect a patient to be insane or anything really outside of what the social norms of being in that type of hospital setting were. Like, it does make sense that the pseudo patients kind of fell in line. However, these people went to the hospitals to be admitted. They were admitted and they acted like patients the entire time. So there wasn't really any way for them to convince the hospitals to let them go, which is why it is often criticized that when Rosenhan sent these people to these hospitals, he sent them there without a roadmap for what the hell they were supposed to do. Many of them didn't really know what to do to get out. So when peer reviews were looking at this fact, they were like, the fact that somebody's hospital stay was anywhere from a week to 52 days, unfortunately, is on the fault of the pseudo patient more so than the actual institution itself. But I would argue that it's also Rosenhan's fault because as the conductor of the experiment, you're supposed to lay out the certain measurements and the certain, not conditions, but just do risk management. Figure out, like, you're sending real people into something. You need to remember that these are people and how people actually act. You know what I'm saying? Instead of doing it just directly as is and just throwing them to the wolves, essentially. And it's really sad that a lot of them, majority of them, according to what Rosenhan had reported, were dealing with all of these terrible environments. There should have been more care to ensure that these people are psychologically and physically safe when they're doing all of this. But that's not really how it turned out. And he also pointed out that there are a lot of inconsistencies with how Rosenhan's experiment came out and then any interview, any follow-up after that, Rosenhan would be incredibly inconsistent, or he would get really frustrated with people when they would start probing and asking him about his process, because it wasn't terrible, but it wasn't what is needed, if that makes sense. So the way that he does it, especially with the pseudo patients, is extremely spotty. And some reports say that he lied about the number of pseudo patients and his level of involvement within this entire experiment, because it turns out he was probably lying about a whole bunch of details. And as I was researching for this, I found an interview of this woman named Susanna Callahan. She wrote a book called The Great Pretender, where she is airing all of Rosenhan's lies within his scientific process out. And some of the cliff notes of what she was talking about is she tells us that Rosenhan initially wanted to take his students on a field trip to the mental institutions, so that instead of his students talking about these places, that they could go and see schizophrenia specifically up close and personal, or even live with schizophrenic people. But luckily, Stanford learned from the last time they allowed a bunch of co-eds to go into an institutional space. So they said, no, we're not letting you do that. Another thing was, again, Rosenhan was very critical of psychology, like to the nth degree, a lot more than his peers. So he had a bias throughout this entire study to make these institutions look a certain way, and it clouded his entire stance on this entire thing. She also said, and this is kind of one of my favorite parts, we're getting into the nitty-gritty, we're getting into the messiest parts of it. She also said that the pseudo patients were essentially BS, because she asked why no one thought it was weird that decades later after the study, no one has been identified. Rosenhan talks about 8 pseudo patients. Remember, 3 women and 5 men. And it's decades later. Why hasn't anyone stepped up? Why hasn't anyone talked about their involvement, because in some of these other studies, you normally have follow-ups where peer reviews can go back, or literature reviews can go back and interview or talk to people that took part in the experiment to get a more well-rounded view and take on what's going on. And because she couldn't find anything on them, even though she had basically everything from that experiment, she had like hospital reports, she had multiple taped interviews with Rosenhan, words that he had said himself, but she couldn't figure out who these pseudo patients were, and she decided that she was just going to go find out. So she went on to find 2 of the supposed 8, and learned that both were Rosenhan's former students. One was in their master's and the other one was in their undergrad program. So while they were hospitalized, though, they had 2 completely different experiences. One went out of their way to avoid taking medication because Rosenhan had hammered it down as like one of the guidelines of like, do not take the meds that they give you. Like, you can pretend that you do, hide it under your tongue, whatever, but do not take the medication. The other patient from a different hospital, he was only given liquid medication, so he couldn't avoid it. And he writes in his notes that he felt very pleasant. And I think the biggest thing that this pseudo patient said was he didn't think that the trazodone, I think is what they were given, tolrazodone, was going to really affect him very much. But it turns out it did. And he had a pleasant time in the hospital. Honestly, he said that he had a nice time, and his reports were not as like bleak and dark as the ones that Rosenhan were reporting on for these other pseudo patients. And worst of all, she finds like the most damning part of this entire thing, which is someone told Susan Callahan that at parties, Rosenhan would bring these wigs out. He'd always bring out wigs. He was a very, you know, animated storyteller. So anytime he had parties, he would run up to his room and open this closet full of wigs, full of them, and put them on to like give a show, apparently. So when she heard that, she realized that in one of the medical files, there was a patient picture that she couldn't make out because it was very much of the time. It was very grainy. She couldn't really see who the picture was. And Rosenhan was bald. So she didn't think it was him until she zoomed in, looked very close, and saw that it was a picture of him at Havford State Hospital. And during his stay, he was trying to remain undercover. So while going through the records, she learned that on top of him going in, saying the same thing that the other pseudo patients were saying, which is, I'm having auditory hallucinations, I keep hearing thud, empty hollow, blah, blah, blah. He was also saying things like, I feel radio waves and I can hear what people are thinking. I can hear it. He told the hospital that the reason why he thinks that he needs to go and be admitted is because he thinks that the voices are better insulated in the hospital. I'm laughing because I know it's fake and I know that he's doing too much. Like, I'm trying to be serious. I was serious throughout majority, but when you think about it, like he is doing too much. But even psychiatrists that Callahan ended up interviewing about this whole thing, they said that hospitals would still give him an available bed because they don't want patients who are saying that they're distressed from things like that to go home or somewhere else and gravely harm themselves. It's said that suicidality or someone's, active ability, active drive, past ideation, past thinking about it, past planning is kind of the biggest thing that psychiatrists worry about when they meet patients who are saying that they have all of this, because that level of distress can cause someone to do a very permanent solution to a treatable and temporary problem. You know what I mean? But the thing is, Rosenhan wasn't good at acting, so nobody was convinced that this fucking professor with a wig was being for real. Nobody thought that, like, he was being for real and that he needed to be admitted, aside from taking him in for, like, I think in this hospital stay for Haverford, he was only there for 9 days-ish. And I think this was like one of his initial reports that made him want to go through with getting pseudo patients and everything together, because he placed so much pressure on his students to take place in the study. Like, it made a lot of students uncomfortable because he was frantic and really wanted to get the study off the ground, no matter what it took. He even paid for the one pseudo patient that stayed for 52 days. He paid for that person to be in the hospital for 52 days. The person didn't need to be in the hospital for longer than maybe a week or so, but he paid for them to stay for 52 days. Unnecessarily. To make the argument that psychiatrists don't know what they're doing and are unnecessarily hospitalizing people for longer than they need to. but you're paying for the hospital to do that. You know what I'm saying? So when I looked at it and reread this entire thread and reread this entire rabbit hole, because now we're climbing out of the rabbit hole, we're getting to conclusions. The most common thread was like, when the more you read about Rosenhan's train of thought, the more you're like, oh, he's got like a personal vendetta against psychiatry just as a whole, and wants to be the person that like outshines everyone else, and wants to be the person that's on the cutting edge or the brink of this whole thing, even though he is from a field of study that's not taken seriously because it's not considered as real medicine. That doesn't make sense to me. It never made sense to me. So it's just insane that he went through these great lengths to make something seem one way, and then as people started investigating into it more, it became an absolute mess. And that, folks, is one of the reasons why I love this science and reading about research so much, is because you get to see the whole array of kind of what happens within these institutions. What blocks people from studying one thing, but what has someone feel like, especially before the Institutional Review Board, which that's a whole different thing, became a thing, like there were really no guidelines or policies for how studies needed to be conducted, to where they could just do whatever they wanted for a while before human rights violations were brought up and environmental things were brought up. But this is from an era of when babies were experimented on as if they were just non-sentient beings. You would have a lot of animal treatments where the animal doesn't really have a lot of DNA or much in common with humans, to the degree that you can argue human cognition. But we have so many studies where they use animals to make arguments and draw connections about human interaction. So with this, it's just, I don't want to diminish what Rosenhan found out. He found out that, hospitals were in fact mistreating their patients. Like, that was already a well-known rumor or a well-known fact around that time, especially because many people were being sent there for things like hysteria, homosexuality, and they were often lobotomized or often given these electro treatments that they don't really need, that were way disproportionate to what the setting calls for, or what the mental problem calls for. It's way more intense. It's way more intense. So he did highlight that. He did point out how some of these hospitals really do mistreat their patients to a scary degree. Any level of abuse within hospitals, it doesn't matter if it's just being verbally mistreated or being completely ignored. You don't want that in a hospital setting. So him highlighting that, and the American Psychiatric Association taking that seriously enough to where they legitimately made large sweeping changes and broke down everything, is good. But as far as his experiment and how well it was done, it's pretty bad. It's pretty bad.